All That's Left is made possible by our Patreon supporters. To help us continue this work, please consider contributing at patreon.com/leftvoice and make sure to visit our website at leftvoice.org. Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. My name is Oden. The Democratic Socialists of America is the largest socialist organization in the US. It currently has over 90,000 members across the country, compared to just 6,500 members a decade ago. DSA's membership exploded in the aftermath of Donald Trump's election, bringing about a new activist energy. But in recent years, DSA has returned to its social democratic roots and to an overwhelming focus on electoral politics, specifically on supporting the Democratic Party and progressive Democratic candidates in elections like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and on trying to push the Democratic Party to take up progressive reforms. But despite DSA's popularity, the group's founder, Michael Harrington, remains relatively obscure. Michael Harrington was the most important advocate of democratic socialism in the US in the second half of the 20th century. He was a public intellectual and political activist who once led the Socialist Party, and he founded DSA in 1982. Throughout his life, Harrington advocated for working within the Democratic Party, being on the, quote, left wing of the possible, as he put it. His conservative socialism, or so-called socialism, perhaps I should say, led him to rein in the more radical elements of the left, forging alliances with liberals and making whatever deals were necessary to avoid alienating Democrats. As I'll discuss today with my guest, Harrington's politics, strategy, and vision are alive and well in DSA and in the wider US left. Today, my guest is Doug Greene, who has just released a biography of Michael Harrington called A Failure of Vision, Michael Harrington and the Limits of Democratic Socialism. Doug is an independent communist historian who is also the author of Communist Insurgent, Blanqui's Politics of Revolution. In this interview, we'll discuss who Michael Harrington was, his politics and where they led him, and his legacy, particularly the ways in which, as Doug puts it, Harrington continues to cast a long shadow over DSA. Doug, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, you have the distinction of being our first author interview, and I just finished this book that you wrote, and I'm excited to talk about it with you. Before we dig into his life and his politics in more detail, just as a way of introducing this topic for people who are unfamiliar with him, who was Michael Harrington?
Well, Michael Harrington was probably the most prominent democratic socialist in the United States in the latter half of the 20th century. He he's most famous for writing a book called The Other America in the early 60s, which is a seminal work on poverty in the United States, and was very influential with the Great Society programs of that era. He also wrote about a dozen other books on everything from philosophy to socialism to the third world to two memoirs. But in addition to that, he was also a dedicated political activist. He was at one point the head of the Socialist Party of America, and he was the founder of both the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee and the Democratic Socialists of America. And Democratic Socialists of America, or DSA, is currently the largest nominal socialist group in the United States since the 1940s. So he has a legacy in terms of the organization he founded is not only still here, but it's very large. So it makes sense to look at the founder of that organization.
Yeah, and I think it's what really comes out in your book is that he was actually a very influential public intellectual of his day. Like you mentioned, his really famous book, The Other America, was really influential among like Lyndon B. Johnson and a lot of the Democrats of the day as well.
Yes, it was. He like if you go like searches on YouTube, you will find him debating William F. Buckley, who is a prominent conservative. You'll find him on C-SPAN, and he was a regular speaker at college campuses and at many kind of he would you would find him involved in all kinds of left-wing events of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and actually the 50s too, now that I think about it. And like his involvement, say, with the Great Society, like he was actually brought to the White House to advise, President Johnson and, the team coming up with the Great Society program. So, yeah, he was in the halls of power at one point, albeit just as kind of this advisor. So he was very prominent, very well known.
Returning to his influence in democratic socialism, Michael Harrington's motivating ideology was known as realignment, which he personally describes realignment as the quote unquote left wing of realism. But in the book, in fact, literally in the title of the book, you call realignment a failure of vision. So, my biggest question today is about this ideology of realignment. And I was wondering, what exactly is realignment? And also, what did this strategy, this ideology look like in practice for Michael Harrington and his allies throughout the decades?
Sure. So before I get to why the title is, called the failure vision, let's talk about realignment. So Harrington is looking at the United States, and it's an advanced capitalist country, but it doesn't have what a lot of Western European countries have, which is some kind of socialist, social democratic, or labor party to, represent the interests of the working class in the halls of government. Instead, there is the Democrats and the Republicans. So he's kind of asking why this is so and how this can be changed. And he argues that even though there's nothing like the British Labour Party here, he says that the labor unions, mainly both the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which eventually became the AFL-CIO, they essentially formed their own labor party. It's kind of like a secret, he says. It's unknown to everybody, including actually to the people in those unions as well. But that's, we'll leave that aside. So he thinks that people like Samuel Gompers and George Meany were essentially the equivalent of the labor leaders in Britain, France, or wherever, which if you know anything about those figures, to point them as like some kind of socialist is kind of laughable. These were labor bureaucrats and incredibly anti-communist and racist as well. But basically, he says that they pushed within as union leaders for various programs that would be equivalent to like the social welfare programs pursued by Western European social democracy, both in the New Deal and later in the 60s. And he's saying they did this under the umbrella of the Democratic Party. And in addition to this, that there is something he calls the new class that he sees after World War II. He sees that the class structure of advanced capitalist societies is changing. That instead of just workers and capitalists, you have this new class of technicians, professionals, bureaucrats, and what have you, and that in Eastern Europe, he believes they all became totalitarians. But he says in places like the United States, the possibility opens for these, this new class, who in many cases are in universities, they can align with labor and also the civil rights movement, and they can become this new majority. So Harrington says that we need to join together the labor bureaucracy, the new class, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, all these kind of like, left progressive movements. And we need to transform the Democratic Party. Because he says, like, the Republicans are a big business party. And he says the Democrats also have racists and capitalists in them, but they have all this progressive constituency. So he basically wants to kick out all the racists and capitalists from the Democratic Party, transfer them to the Republican Party, and therefore the Democrats will become a social democratic party. The parties will be realigned, and it'll be more traditional party structure like Western Europe. And after that is done, he says, we will then proceed to elect these people, and that we will eventually we will create a welfare state like Sweden, and then somewhere down the line we'll create socialism. And he says, as first steps, you need to have work with liberals. Liberals are natural allies of socialists and social democrats. You need to have both an inside and an outside. So he didn't originate the idea of realignment, but he refined it. When he's developing these ideas, he's a very influential figure in the Socialist Party. So he wants this outside as well, but he also wants the inside. So basically his realignment strategy, and he actually says it in one of his articles, it's not only the left wing of realism, but it's also the only place where a political beginning can happen. So actually everything he advocates, it hinges on this, on realignment. And the thing is, like, it sounds, I would suspect, to someone who doesn't know too much about socialist or Marxist politics, it sounds very grand, very, it sounds like he's actually got a realistic way to socialism where you can avoid revolution and all this and third party efforts, when in fact, and this gets to your other question about how this worked in practice, is it sounds like 33rd dimensional chess, but in practice it just means voting for Democrats every 2 to 4 years. And so a lot of I didn't say this in the book, but I could say this, like all his articles on election years, 1964, 68, etc., they literally could have been copied and pasted. There might be some specifics, but in general it would be, we need to elect Johnson or Carter because it will, we need to keep the ultra-right racist Republicans out of power. And we can't be purist, and we got to hold our nose and create space for the left. And that's what we got to do. And if you look at it in practice, it's not just voting for Democrats, although it is that. But it's like whenever there's even a hint of independent action that threatens to break with the Democrats, he ends up opposing it. So in 1964, to give one example, there was the Mississippi Freedom Democrat Party, which was civil rights organizers in the South who were actually supported by labor unions and students. So it was this kind of almost this kind of quasi-realignment group. They were essentially trying to create a non-segregated Democratic Party. And for their efforts, these people were being killed, for their organizing. And when they actually went to the Democratic Convention that year, Harrington's allies, he wasn't at the convention, but his allies were, and they were trying to convince these organizers, you need to just accept a compromise deal of only 2 delegate seats because we got to elect Johnson. And, a lot of these activists were angry about this. And he didn't, and another instance, in 1984, there was the Rainbow Coalition of Jesse Jackson, Jackson pursued kind of this New Deal type domestic policy and a foreign policy that was, non-intervention in Central America, support, recognizing Palestine, which was, quite, within the confines of the Democratic Party, that's unheard of. And his supporters were civil rights people, labor, like progressive labor unions, all this kind of left liberal constituency within the Democratic Party. And Harrington didn't support that because the labor bureaucracy supported Walter Mondale. Now, Harrington did support Jackson in 1988, but Jackson kind of actually was even retreating from his, more lefty-sounding rhetoric at that time, and Harrington kind of wanted to get behind that. But he still fell in line with Michael Dukakis. So basically, what I would say is it fails because there's no path to socialism in the Democratic Party. He builds this whole idea on a bunch of faulty premises. So the problem with the inside-outside strategy, which is, another name for this, is in order to stay inside the Democratic Party, you have to sacrifice the outside. And in order to stay in the Democratic Party, you have to do a number of things, which he's willing to do. You have to, you can't do mass militancy in the streets like they're doing in the against the Vietnam War, because that could embarrass the liberals in power, and you need those as allies. Well, you don't want to obviously do anything illegal, And you can't oppose U.S. imperialism because obviously the Democrats are complicit with that. You got to be anti-communist because again, this is a bourgeois party, and his whole idea of the party structure is he thinks like all these different elements in the Democratic Party are some like on some kind of equal playing field. Now it's true that a lot of people, who from labor unions, civil rights, do support the Democratic Party. That's true, but it's a bourgeois party fundamentally owned lock, stock, and barrel by the capitalist class. The reason, but it serves a function of helping the legitimacy of capitalism by putting on the face of the party of people in order to pursue its regressive policies. In terms of its class basis and alignment, the Democrats are no different than the Republicans. And Harrington really doesn't understand that and never did. And ultimately, his policies are not just his policies or the organizations he's been a part of, although that's true, but they've had a long detrimental effect on the wider American left, which in many cases, even if they don't know who Harrington is, they repeat a lot of his same arguments about lesser evilism, you know, we have to defeat the ultra right, etc., and create space for the left. You hear this all. Just look at any article from The Nation or Jacobin or etc., particularly on an election year, and you'll see that. So basically, his vision fails because there is no path to socialism through the Democratic Party, through reformism, through a parliamentary road. Instead, he ends up training people, this whole strategy of realignment, to basically give their voting for the Democrats some kind of Marxist, gloss, but really you're foot soldiers for an imperialist party. And that, of course, is why that vision fails, because you're not building towards socialism. You're helping to maintain the hegemony of the class enemy, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what struck me when reading this book is, as you were saying, this consistent theme of just always opposing what's happening outside the party and always doing or making, as I think you wrote in the book, pretty much any deal necessary in order to not be isolated from the Democratic Party. And his political trajectory is very interesting, and you go into detail about his time in the various groups, parties, and formations, and things like that. But again, like there's this theme of kind of like first as tragedy, then as farce, and then as farce again, and then as farce again, and then over and over again. You see how he supports Lyndon B. Johnson, Hubert Humphrey. He supports Carter. He has an anyone but Reagan strategy. Over and over again, he just tries to like legitimize the Democrats, legitimize these capitalist parties, and always put this like blind faith as well into the labor bureaucracy. And it's funny also how you said about how socialism is somewhere down the line, but through all of these cases, there's really very little like actual Marxism, actual socialism in what Michael Harrington promotes and what he argues and things like that. It seems like socialism is always like infinitely down the line in some kind of indeterminate time. We'll see when we get there, although he frankly doesn't even really discuss socialism very much, from what I can gather.
Yeah, it's a receding horizon. If you read, he wrote two books with socialism in the title, one in the early 70s and one right before he passed away. And there is all this kind of talk about socialism and trying to get there. Because on the one hand, he's like, it would be great to have a welfare state like in Sweden, etc. But he doesn't think that's actually socialist. He thinks it's some kind of halfway house with capitalism and socialism. So he wants to get past that, but his prescriptions are very vague and, I think like just nonsensical and unrealistic. So there's obviously, and I joke about this, that it's really like voting harder, like just keep voting for this and you'll eventually get there. He wants to buy out the capitalists. He doesn't foresee any kind of like armed resistance from the capitalist class, to any kind of peaceful transition. He thinks you can use like there are good bureaucrats in the capitalist state that we can use to fight against the bad bureaucrats. and it's very amorphous, honestly. If you get into it, there's really it just feels like magic. It's going to happen because you vote hard enough, which that sounds kind of like mean, but I really think that I don't actually know how he gets from A to B.
Yeah, I think that's harsh but true, a very accurate characterization that I would definitely agree with. Connecting Michael Harrington and his ideology kind of back to the debates of the time, the other major socialist movements. One name that comes up quite a lot throughout this book is Max Shachtman, who first we encounter him in the book because he was leading I believe, the Independent Socialist League when it fused with the Socialist Party's youth wing to form the Young Socialist League. And that's, from what I understand, where he first came into close contact with Max Shachtman. And you write that he was Michael Harrington's most important political mentor who shaped his understanding of Marxism and socialism. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about Max Shachtman and especially what role he played in Harrington's beliefs, especially up until they kind of split over the Vietnam War.
Sure. Yeah, Max Shachtman, in many respects, I think is actually a more interesting figure than Michael Harrington. He was originally born in what was then the Russian Empire. He emigrated to the United States very young, and he was a very early member of the Communist Party of America. And later, he joined with James Cannon and was a founder of the American Trotskyism. And that Cannon and Shachtman were among the two leaders. And Shachtman was a leading figure. He was a friend of Leon Trotsky. He presided over the founding convention of the Fourth International in 1938. So this is no slouch. This is someone who is very important in that movement. In 1939, 1940, there's a major split in the Socialist Workers' Party, which Shachtman was leading. And he was opposed by Cannon and Trotsky. And it's basically, to simplify it a bit, a large part of this debate is over the class nature of the Soviet Union, with Shachtman and Trotsky saying the Soviet Union is a workers' state, it has a planned economy and all of that. It has a degenerated bureaucracy that needs to be overthrown by the workers. But against imperialism, we defend it. That's to simplify that a bit. Shachtman is saying this is a new class. It is this bureaucratic collectivist empire that is really it's a new form of imperialism, and they kind of split over that. And this his position on the Soviet Union changes a bit because at various times he seems to think it's like really no better or no worse than the United States or Western imperialism. But as the 1940s go on, he thinks it's objectively worse. And this has ramifications as well in how Shachtman views things. So in the 40s, during World War II, Shachtman's group, which was at first the Workers' Party, was actually leading rank and file caucuses and strikes against the no strike pledge during the war. And they found themselves in opposition to the Communist Party, who supported no strikes. And they kind of, like the Workers' League and Shachtman, ended up essentially allying with segments of the labor bureaucracy because they saw the Stalinists and the Communist Party as the greater evil on the domestic front as well as on international issues as well. And by the 1950s, Shachtman himself, although not quite his organization, was offering backhanded support to the Korean War. He thought, it should be done democratically, that, we should support those progressive elements in South Korea and etc. But he's more or less advocating for support for the Korean War. Again, his organization isn't. And Shachtman is also He's also developing these ideas of realignment, which Harrington will then refine. So basically, when Harrington kind of encounters Shachtman has developed this analysis of the Soviet Union as bureaucratic collectivists. So this new evil empire of a totalitarian state that's worse than imperialism. And Harrington picks that up. Shachtman is also supporting the idea, elements in the labor bureaucracy and running candidates in the Democratic Party to transform it in a more social democratic direction. Harrington not only takes that up, but he refines that as to a full-blown strategy. And Harrington actually joins Shachtman's group in the 50s after an early stint in the Socialist Party. And because the Shachtman group is so small, Harrington's actually he rises very quickly. And they eventually refuse with the Socialist Party, which at the later 50s, which is dying. And because the Socialist Party is really an empty shell, that Harrington and Shachtman essentially ascend to the leadership. And Harrington really accepts this worldview. Like when he's involved in the civil rights movement, he's conferring with Shachtman, he's working with people like Bayard Rustin, and he's enforcing things like anti-communist clauses and red baiting. He does that in SDS. His objection to SDS is they're insufficiently anti-communist. So he basically has taken all this ideas from Shachtman, and they split over the Vietnam War. But you got to be clear about why this is. For instance, Shachtman is gung ho for the war. He's pretty much full blown anti communist at that point, war till victory. And he's also completely identified with the labor bureaucracy. He doesn't want to align with progressive elements in the labor bureaucracy. He just identifies with all of it. And he doesn't like the new left at all. He thinks they're a bunch of freaks and lunatics. He hates them. And this is actually, and this is something Harrington noted, is I'm actually the one who's true to Shachtmanism, because Shachtman's abandoning it. Because throughout the 1960s, Harrington prefers the more liberal elements of the labor bureaucracy. And even though he's often at loggerheads with the new left, particularly its more revolutionary elements, he always wants to, he doesn't never completely cuts off contact. He still wants to build realignment. And with the Vietnam War, I'll save a bit, I guess I'll save some of the discussion for his specific policies. But after 1968, he's saying the United States needs to get out of Vietnam. Now, this is not a principled anti-imperialist position. For one thing, a lot of the ruling class by that point had accepted that the Vietnam War needed to end. And after 1968, there was a Republican in the White House. So it was a little easier for a Democrat to come out against the Vietnam War. And this actually leads to a split between Shachtman and Harrington. There's essentially internal warfare within the Socialist Party. And by the time Shachtman dies in 1972, Harrington has already left the Socialist Party. But before that, he was supporting the candidate of George McGovern, who kind of represented this, this liberal, new majority idea, kind of soft, opposition to the war within the Democratic Party. Well, Shachtman and his cohort in the Socialist Party were essentially supporting Richard Nixon. So this is the weirdest split I think I've ever heard about on the left, with the Socialist Party of Eugene Debs is split between supporters of George McGovern and Richard Nixon.
I was shocked. I had to reread that part several times
Yeah.
to think, was I reading it correctly, that the Socialist Party was actually, parts of it supporting Richard Nixon? Absolutely incredible, honestly.
It is. Now, just to finish up, when Harrington resigns from the Socialist Party, is a long letter, and what he says is I disagree on tactical issues with people like Shachtman, but I don't reject the core ideas of bureaucratic collectivism, realignment, orientation of the labor bureaucracy, and all of this. I still am loyal to that. And to give you an idea of how deep his loyalty to Shachtman goes, the book on socialism he wrote, the first one, which I forget if it was either when it was published, if it was 1970 or 71, it's dedicated to Max Shachtman. At that point, he's at loggerheads with Shachtman. They're fighting. They're not even on speaking terms, really. But he's so loyal. It's this man shaped my views. I'm dedicating my book on socialism to him. So basically, Harrington is someone who's just carrying on the baton of Shachtman. In a certain sense, he's more true to the original vision of his mentor than his mentor ended up being.
The focus of your book is, largely, of course, Michael Harrington, but also Max Shachtman and his allies around that time. But as you also point out in some parts, there were, of course, also leftists, especially revolutionary leftists and communists, who were really critical of Michael Harrington. Actually, anecdotally, I was speaking to an older comrade about this who was around at the time and was saying that um, I believe the SWP at the time and his comrades would actually go to Michael Harrington events and like hand out flyers and stuff, like obviously against Michael Harrington because they knew that he was so influential among people and he was such a public figure. And you mentioned, for example, Peter Camejo of the SWP, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how revolutionary socialists responded to Michael Harrington and Max Shachtman and others at the time.
Sure. So I'll get to the SWP in a moment, but the first would actually be SDS, which is Students for a Democratic Society. Now he was actually helped write the Huron Statement, which was like their founding document in 1962, and they were not at that point revolutionaries, and they actually accepted a lot of his ideas on realignment, supporting the labor bureaucracy and the civil rights movement. But they were actually saying they put the onus for the Cold War on the United States as opposed to the Soviet Union, although they rejected the Soviet Union and they don't call themselves Marxists. Harrington basically is like fights with them over this, and he kind of makes up. But as the Vietnam War develops and SDS becomes more involved with the anti-war movement and continues to move left, they formally break with him because they're willing to basically there are elements in SDS that support victory for the National Liberation Front. They're willing to engage in militant street actions, burn their draft cards. They welcome communists at demonstrations. For Harrington, this is all no. And this, to give you an idea even further, this is like they break with Harrington basically formally in like 1965. And a few years later, SDS itself kind of falls apart. And you have out of SDS something called the New Communist Movement, which are like these Marxist Leninists, these Maoists look to Vietnam, Cuba, and China. So they definitely want nothing to do with Harrington. They consider him an imperialist stooge and all that. These are people who are going to they're some like people like the Weather Underground. They're actually like launching bombings, but most of like the New Communist Movement is either doing student organizing or worker organizing, and they completely reject Harrington. I'll add the caveat that the survivors of the New Communist Movement in the 80s kind of actually come back to Harrington when they re-enter the Democratic Party in the Jesse Jackson campaigns. And some of them actually are in DSA now, but that's a whole other story. So so again, the New Communist Movement, they reject Harrington. With the Socialist Workers Party, which is still at this point in the 60s and into the 70s, the premier Trotskyist organization in the United States. Is there, like, they obviously do not like Harrington. So you will find debates actually, both reprinted in like the SWP's literature between Harrington and like leading like figures in the SWP. One is George Novak, who debates him in 1972, I believe, and writes critical reviews of Harrington's more theoretical work. And those debates, I think, are more or less correct. That like Harrington is basically advocating, has a revisionist Marxism. He's supporting a big business policy party. He is supporting the Vietnam War, in fact, and he's not advocating socialism. And in 1976, Peter Camejo, I believe he was then the vice presidential candidate for the Socialist Workers Party, or he might have been even the presidential, I forget. But a few weeks before the election, there is a debate between Harrington and Camejo, which, Camejo is like, you're not going to get, fight racism and sexism and militarism by supporting racist, sexist, and militarists, which is the Democratic Party. And he's also noting, like, listen, you're saying all this, but you're voting Democrat. You're arguing for us to vote Democrat. Why don't you just call yourself what you are, a Democrat? Which, it's, and Harrington himself in he, in his response, he's essentially saying, listen, there's a class struggle at the ballot box between Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. The corporate classes for Ford and the working classes for Carter, and we got to make our stand. We got to stand. He defends the record of American Menshevism, the Popular Front, He even defends like the fact that his organization supports apartheid Israel in 1973. So I guess to say like to the Socialist Workers Party, to their credit, they reprinted all of Harrington's responses whenever they debated him. So if you go to the original sources in either the Militant or the International Socialist Review, you'll find it there. And there wasn't, I can't remember too much engagement between the new communist movement and Harrington directly in the 70s. But something else just to kind of note on this, when Harrington formed his group DSOC, or the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, in the 70s, there weren't many veterans from SDS in it at the time. There was basically like young students at the time, older people, but kind of this missing cohort who would have come of age when Harrington split with SDS, because a lot of them had very bitter memories of it. And Harrington was always kind of like very like repentant about that and apologizing for his behavior. There were moderate elements from SDS who, something called the New American Movement, which they originally kind of like these third world Marxist Leninists, but they kind of like mellowed out and just became social democrats. And they were actually fused with Harrington's group in 1982 to form DSA. So basically, if you were a revolutionary Marxist in the 60s or 70s, or if you were moving in any way that's to the left of the Democratic Party, you really don't have anything good to say about Michael Harrington. He is not your comrade. But if you're starting to move towards the left wing of realism or moderation or whatever, you might actually look kind of fondly on him. So that would be my answer to that.
So just after that, that kind of takes us up to when he founds the DSA and when he merges with the New American Movement, right?
Yeah.
And so interestingly, he dies in 1989, and that's actually only 7 years after he founds DSA. And I was curious about what DSA looked like in those first years, or what did the organization look like while he was alive and the head of it?
Well, both DSOC, which is the predecessor, and DSA, there's a lot of continuity. So to start with DSOC, if you look at the founding convention, you'll find a lot of like these like social democratic intellectuals like Michael Harrington, Irving Howe. You'll also find like elements in the labor bureaucracy. So there'll be like people from like the United Auto Workers, etc. And these will be like the more left bureaucrats, scare quotes on that, of course. And they tended to be more white and older, etc. So it was very much tied, and there'll be like academics there as well. Now the interesting thing is there's certainly carryover of that into DSA. But when they fuse with the New American Movement, they're like the New American Movement had like a more activist bent, so they weren't just like people like are working within the Democratic Party solely. Like they actually they would be in the streets and everything. So they did have that slightly more like moderate new left activist base. So in like the 80s, I don't think DSA's membership like really got much above 5,000, although they were, because a lot of organizations from the new communist movement had collapsed, they were like probably the largest, if not the largest group on the U.S. left. I think the Communist Party might have been larger, but don't quote me on that. And in addition to this kind of like labor union officialdom and like these kind of like social democratic academics and intellectuals and quasi activists from NAM, there are elected officials in DSA, people in Congress. At one point, actually, the mayor of New York City, David Dinkins, was actually a DSA member. I think,
Oh, I had no idea about
yeah,
that.
I don't know
Interesting.
exactly what he did for socialism, but he was a member of DSA. And I forget the names of like the Congress people, but they had something like three, or I think maybe Ron Bellams was one actually, and these were people who were in Congress, obviously Democrats, but also counted DSA as they considered themselves members. So that was kind of like their shape in like the 80s and 90s.
I feel like many DSA members, I mean, maybe even perhaps most DSA members haven't heard of Michael Harrington, or maybe like they don't know anything about him beyond the fact that he founded the group. And I remember last summer we did, I think, publish a written interview with you on the website. And I was kind of looking back at that, and I noticed that when we posted the article, the interview on Facebook, there were several comments from DSA people who were kind of like, who cares? We don't know who he is. He's not relevant anymore. But what you argue in the book, and I'm assuming this is like a major reason why you chose to write about Michael Harrington, is that his ideas are alive and well in the DSA. You say he casts a shadow over the organization. And so, how do his ideas inform DSA right now and its leadership, and also Jacobin magazine? And what does the strategy of realignment look like right now, even though people in the DSA and people in Jacobin wouldn't necessarily use the term realignment?
Sure, that's a great question. The thing I would agree, like most people in DSA probably don't know Harrington, have not read him. But like I say, I do think there's a long shadow. So let me explain. So after he dies, DSA at some point in the 90s, they actually abandoned the realignment strategy and they adopt an inside outside strategy. Although they're still supporting Democrats. Although sometimes it gets a little interesting, like in 2000, they're actually split three ways between the Democrats, the Socialist Party, and the Green Party. So in terms of today, though, there's like a big resurgence of DSA, particularly after the Bernie Sanders campaign of 2015-16, where they went from something like 5 to 10,000 to, I think the current figure is at least 100,000. And there is a lot of continuity with Harringtonism. So the most basic thing is obviously, like a lot of their members now are more younger, and they're not a lot of them are not in academia or labor officialdom, but they still do have members of academia and labor officialdom in them. But the big continuity is the fact that they're supporting the Democratic Party, and this can be evidenced by the fact that they have something like 100 members elected who are, I think they're all Democrats. The most famous, obviously, being Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the few other members of the so-called squad, like Jamal Bowman, and there's other like local and state officials. So the fact is, like, that is the most obvious continuity between Harrington then and now. And the fact is, like, they got their big boost by supporting Bernie Sanders, who he may not be officially a Democrat, but he caucuses them, he votes for them. He ran for the nomination in their party, and he supports imperialism and Zionism. So I don't think Harrington would actually have a problem with any of that. And so you have that basic thing going on there. And the fact is, like, DSA still does not have a revolutionary program for socialism. They still think socialism will be achieved through some kind of democratic or parliamentary path. In terms of what realignment looks like now, the fact is, again, there really was, as I've tried to emphasize, it really meant nothing in practice in terms of like a strategy beyond voting Democrats. But there have been people who I would say are trying to like update it for the 21st century. And there's in 2015 or 16, I forget when, there was an article like a party of a new type, and I think it was by Seth Ackerman, I believe, and he wrote basically that we want to create a surrogate party within the Democratic Party. We're going to build up our forces. That's what DSA is going to do by electing people as Democrats, and eventually we'll split off and form like some kind of independent party, which, if you think about it, is really just realignment. And another figure who I think is really advocating the same thing is Eric Blanc with his idea of the dirty break, which you build up these forces and eventually you split off. But the thing is, it sounds like, almost like this again, it's like this grand strategy, but it's really not, because a lot of these people, they backed away from even this. I think they just kind of said it because it was an off-year election, and but in Blanc himself in 2020 what came out for Biden, and has even retreated from that. So, and you have caucuses within DSA who advocate this kind of realignment for the 21st century, and you do also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention them. There's something called the North Star Caucus, who are just pretty much like old school Michael Harrington people, like They don't even like some of like the more aesthetic changes in DSA, even if like the fundamental politics are not all that different. And these are people. It's like just support the Democrats every 4 years, and we love Sweden and all this, and Biden is like our hero, and NATO is great and all this stuff. So you have that. So it's like there are different flavors of it. The other thing in terms of Jacobin is like Jacobin started before this DSA resurgence of 2016, and it was founded by someone named Bhaskar Sankara, who is a young man. He joined DSA, I believe, like right out of high school. In his youth, he had read like Trotsky's My Life and Michael Harrington. Apparently, he really didn't like Trotsky's My Life. I mean, I guess he doesn't like good literature, but that's another story. Anyhow, he counts if you read his interviews about like the ideology behind DSA. Oh, I'm sorry, behind Jacobin. He's like, Harrington's one of my influences. Yeah, we take a little difference from him, but if you look at like the Jacobin itself has become kind of like a think tank for a certain section of DSA, and I think also it was like an unofficial campaign organ for Bernie Sanders in both his campaigns. Is basically he's saying like, we're gonna gradually have this gradualist way to socialism. We need to support like the squad and Bernie Sanders and all the like within the Democratic Party. And if like Harrington, I'm sorry, like Sankara like really likes things like the Popular Front. He really likes class collaborationism. Actually, so did Michael Harrington, which he liked that era of the Communist Party. And you'll find that with and also like uh, Harrington, Jacobin will publish like they within the last 2 days they published like why we need Bernie Sanders to run again, and why Joe Biden, like why isn't he being the adult in the room? It's like just a fundamental misunderstanding of like the role of the president in U.S. imperialism. So these are like ideas that Harrington himself would really, he'd be okay with this because he was part of like this kind of milieu. Like he wrote for like Dissent and the Nation, which I should add, actually, Bhaskar Sarkar owns the Nation now, or he's the president of it, or what have you. So a lot of those politics find their way into Jacobin. Which the one difference I will note though is Jacobin does have like this. It has like this kind of almost like meaningless nostalgia for the past of the left. So they'll actually publish nice things about the Paris Commune or even the Bolshevik Revolution. It just has no bearing on present practice. Like you're not going to find them advocating for a Leninist party. Harrington probably wouldn't like that because he didn't like anything with a hammer and sickle on it or anything that smacked of revolution. And it should actually be noted in a funny irony, Harrington hated Jacobinism, which the magazine has its name on. So
Yeah, that is a funny irony. I totally agree that, I kept kind of trying to think of these differences between Harrington's beliefs and DSA and Jacobin. And so what struck me first was I was like, oh, well, Michael Harrington was, a liberal Zionist and was like a lifelong supporter of Israel. But then, I realized that actually we had this whole kerfuffle with New York Representative Jamal Bauman in the spring, where basically Bauman, who is endorsed by the DSA, voted actually to give Israel more funding. He went on I guess, like a propaganda trip with other Democrats to Israel. And there was like a piece in Jacobin, at least one piece that was like pretty much kind of in favor of this and saying like, well, at least Jamal Bauman is not as Zionist as Elliot Engel, who he replaced. So it's really interesting the extent to which the strategy that you've described, like realignment and its other iterations, like inside outside, the various breaks, whatever you call them, it leads to very predictable outcomes and a lot of similarities between Harrington's beliefs and DSA. And something else I just wanted to also point out is the parallels between DSA and Jacobin's kind of checkered past and relationships with oppressed groups, and also Michael Harrington and his allies' relationships with oppressed groups. So I was thinking, for example, about how Harrington said that, like, in theory, he supported gay rights, but basically because he didn't want to alienate liberals, he I don't remember the specifics, but he refused to support certain like planks of the various like statements they made, or the various things that he wanted to contribute to the Democratic Party platform. And I know that you talk also about how DSOC struggled with reaching out to Black people and Latino people, and overall we see here also that it's a bit reminiscent of like the class reductionism of the Jacobin wing of the DSA, and some of the themes we've seen, especially in recent articles from DSA and recent issues of Jacobin magazine. So there are parallels there as well, I would argue.
Yeah, so the events you're talking about with Harrington were, I believe, in like the mid '70s. He was pushing something called the Democratic Agenda, which was basically like this New Deal slash Great Society platform at the through the Democratic Party. And there were like these various like gay rights groups who approached him. They wanted his support, and he's like, I can't do that because I'll alienate these more conservative people, and I don't want to put myself out there for like these kind of fringe, what he considered fringe ideas. So he was kind of throwing that under the bus. And he, obviously DSOC really did not have like a large contingent of like Black members. And obviously during the '60s he really hated like Black nationalism, the Black radicalism of the Panthers. He no problem like the more moderate forms of like the civil rights movement, but as it gets into like Black power and shit, he doesn't want anything to do with that. And so there is like, that is kind of like a blind spot. At one point, actually, he's actually after DSOC is founded, like some of the women members actually take him aside at like the celebratory party, and basically like you're really not dealing with like feminist concerns and all that. And he's kind of ruffled by that. So that's like all of that is kind of a blind spot. And the fact is also, just in terms, that I'm just talking about like the U.S. also, but also in terms of international affairs, like anti-imperialism is a big blind spot. He kind of recognizes, okay, people in the third world are suffering and everything, but you can't have like a revolution because that'll just give you totalitarianism. Just play nice and kind of beg the International Monetary Fund and the United States to alleviate poverty, and eventually maybe that'll happen. So he really has a blind spot to that. And of course, like he's a Zionist. He knew the Israeli national anthem by heart as early as like the '40s. So he really, he counts like the prime ministers of Israel as his personal friends. So he's got a blind spot to all this. In terms of more recent, I mean, I bring up the Bernie Sanders campaign of 2016 and 20. Like, there's a blind spot to that. Bernie Sanders is a supporter of U.S. imperialism. He's voted for multiple wars, multiple times. He's voted for apartheid Israel to fund them. DSA endorsed him both times. And they continue to endorse people like AOC, Jamal Bowman, who also support these things. And there are certainly resolutions in DSA that say they do the contrary, but you're supporting these people who are materially backing the U.S. war machine. In terms of Jacobin, if you were to look in Jacobin's issues, for criticism of Bernie Sanders, say his foreign policy, his like bloody militarism, you won't find it. You'll find them saying how he has the best foreign policy of all time, and everything is like, there was something in 2020, something like 300 and plus articles in Jacobin about Bernie Sanders, and it really wasn't critical. It's just like how great he is, and maybe we should vote harder for him so he can win. And there was one article in Jacobin, and I forget who wrote it, but basically is saying like, the left needs to get rid of like, stop dealing with like these cultural fringe issues, which are basically gay rights and anti-racism, and focus on like the more class, only bread and butter issues, which is a big thing with social democrats and these like very trade unionist figures who Harrington himself dealt with, and who obviously influenced crowds in Jacobin. Now, that's not to say all of DSA is like that, but it is to say that it is like a current that is still very influential, including in Jacobin, because there are caucuses in DSA who are very, we call very class reductionist. Like, they really don't, they're not interested in like being the tribune of the people and dealing with like, racism in dealing with like gay oppression. And I'll give you one good example of this actually, and it's something like the organization kind of dealt with. So in 2020, there was all the protests over the killing of George Floyd by the cops, and DSA members were certainly participating in the protests. I don't want to give that impression, but as an organization, they really were not super involved. As individuals, certainly not denying that, but they were more focused on elections, on getting the slew of Democrats into office, as opposed to dealing with being in the streets and fighting this. And that to me is a big blind spot. So yeah.
I think I know the answer to this question, but all in all, would you think it's fair to say that Michael Harrington's legacy was bad for socialism? Did he, on the whole, have a negative impact on the socialist movement?
Yes, he did. I really don't think there's anything positive to get from his legacy in terms of building socialism or communism. He basically would be like an American equivalent to Edward Bernstein or Karl Kautsky, and even I think comparing him to Kautsky is too much credit. But he basically revises Marxism to take away the revolution, the internationalism, this vision of a new society, and basically let's build Sweden in the United States. Maybe at some point down the future we'll do something else, but it's just continual working within the Democratic Party, and it's a Marxism that like it guts out its philosophy, its worldview, and it's just like his ideas were just a justification for the labor bureaucracy and these opportunistic intellectuals. Now, I do want to caveat this by saying he was actually a very talented writer. He was no slouch or fool. Like he actually translated some Marxist texts into English very early from like George Lukács, for instance. So this was no fool, but and he was again a very talented writer and very accessible. I just don't think anything he made accessible was any good. And I think like these ideas on realignment, which if you strip away like his like justification for it, so much of this is like the unspoken common sense of large swaths of the American left. It really does, all these justifications for voting Democrat, lesser evilism, tolerating whatever the candidate is, and accepting these imperialist policies. It doesn't just it wasn't just Harrington, it wasn't just the organizations he founded, but you can find it along large swaths of the very broad American left. And frankly, if we want to even have a hope or possibility of socialism in the United States, we need to unite around a revolutionary program, extra parliamentary action, fighting, to unite the oppressed and exploited, and internationalism, and recognizing that there is no reformist road to socialism and embracing revolution. And no one said that's obviously easy, but I think saying it's easy doesn't mean saying it's going to be hard doesn't mean it's going to be impossible. But I think Harrington's strategy makes socialism impossible because it just ends up shoring up capitalism and turning the wider American left into foot soldiers for the Democratic Party. And I think that should be completely and utterly rejected.
Yeah, and I think it's a little beyond the scope of this particular episode, but in terms of the theoretical legacy toward Marxism, and as you said, the way he was really deeply a revisionist when it came to Marxism, this legacy I think is really really negative, and it's something that you go into a lot in the very detailed appendix that you have to your book. I mean, he, like you said, he removed all of the revolution from Marxism. He opposed dialectical materialism. He didn't believe in this notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat. He also rejected Lenin's theory about imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. And these kinds of things led pretty directly to his beliefs and his actions, and things you see in the DSA these days, for example, with supporting Bernie Sanders, as you mentioned, beliefs about how, for example, imperialism is just like a misguided policy rather than a consequence of capitalism. And so I think that's also interesting is that, like, from a theoretical perspective as well, he did write quite a lot about his beliefs, and he advanced, in addition to realignment or in tandem with it, this idea of like democratic Marxism, which had, I think, a really, really damaging effect because of how deeply revisionist it was.
Yeah, I mean, I let's just say I would not recommend anyone get their education on socialism from Michael Harrington. Like, there's certainly interesting things about his books, but I really would read them more to understand his worldview as opposed to an actual positive vision of socialism or Marxism. And a lot of times he is like repeating revisionist figures like Bernstein, and he's making Marx. I think George Novak actually made this remark. He's turning Marx into like a mild mannered professor after that bears a remarkable resemblance to Michael Harrington himself, someone who's not a revolutionary, but just kind of like this moderate social democrat. And he also does something which, this is maybe just a pet peeve of mine, but it's something like certain segments of academia do, which is like pitting Marx against Engels, like how Engels distorted Marx and like ruined Marx and laid the seeds for totalitarianism, which I don't think is true. I think Marx and Engels were close friends and comrades for close to 40 years. And, Engels carried on his friends, comrades' work, afterwards. And I don't think Engels distorted Marx at all. I just think there might just be different emphasis on what they talked about. And another thing is like Harrington has a very deep-seated anti-communism, which I think should be rejected. And it has definite effects. If you think U.S. imperialism is objectively better than the Soviet Union, that's going to lead to some very bad positions. As saw with him in Vietnam, for instance. And I don't think that's actually a correct characterization of the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe or what have you at all. And the fact also is like the fact that he's like praising people like the racist union leader George Meany as like some kind of principled social democrat, but thinks like Che Guevara is like this evil incarnate. You have to have your wires crossed to come up to some of these conclusions. Like George Meany and those type of politics, which Harrington doesn't exactly share, but certainly apologizes for, is something you want to reject. This labor bureaucracy officialdom, it's completely toxic, and it's certainly like labor officialdom has supported the Democrats for decades, and he is just enamored of that. And it's there's something to be said about workers' self-activity as opposed to just like relying on good bureaucrats to free you and following those type of strategies as well.
As a way of wrapping up, we will, of course, link to your book in the show notes of this episode, and we'll also link to your writing at Left Voice. Where else can listeners follow you, find your work and your writing, and are you working on any new projects that you want to talk about?
Sure. So one place you can follow me is my blog, which is blonkist.blogspot.com, where I reprint pretty much anything I write there, even if it was reprinted somewhere else. And you can also check my Patreon, which I'll share the link with you because I can't read off that address, where you can support me if you want. The other thing I am working on right now, which is actually a finished draft, is a book called "The Dialectics of Saturn on the Question of Stalinism." So this is a lot different. This is dealing with like a lot of these intellectual histories and debates around Stalinism. So I'm looking at like anti-communists, from like people who wrote the Black Book of Communism to fascists, these Cold War anti-communists, to Western Marxists, and like people, fellow travelers of Stalinism, but also, Trotsky, etc. And just kind of looking at like how this kind of plays out using Marx's rubric of like how there's a fatalism to like the anti-communism, but a pseudo necessity to like the pro-Stalin position, and trying to look at, Trotsky as kind of like rejecting those two positions. And hopefully that book will be out, because I worked, it took about a year, but it is done, and I'm looking forward to that. So that's like the only real project like I have on my plate now.
Yeah, and I'll link to your Twitter as well in the show notes. But yeah, thanks so much for joining me today. And like I said, I really enjoyed this book. And just on a personal note, like speaking as someone who's newer to socialism, I think it provides really interesting insights into the US socialist movement in the second half of the 20th century and some of those debates. And I also found it really informative from the perspective of like the the more theoretical problems with realignment and Harrington's revisionism, and kind of counterposing that to the more revolutionary thoughts at the time. So yeah, really enjoyed it, and thank you so much.
No, thank you for having me. It was a great conversation.
Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/leftvoice.org, on Instagram at left_voice, and on Twitter at left_voice. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, and share the show with your friends, your family, coworkers, classmates, comrades, and anyone else who you want to radicalize. And finally, Left Voice is an independent, revolutionary socialist publication, which means that we completely rely on the support of our members and our sympathizers. So that we can continue to bring you more episodes of All That's Left, please subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/leftvoice. We're really excited about this project, and we hope that you'll join us on this journey.